The most recent phase consists of more history about the distant and recent past, and they chronicle more of the unfinished work of rooting out racism. 1978 was not a solution, it turns out. In 1999, Keith Norman wrote, Mark of the Curse, Lingering Racism in Mormon Doctrine. He discusses how the old explanations for why there was a priesthood restriction to begin with, including biblical curses and teachings about unworthiness in the pre-existence, continued to be taught in the church in the absence of any official condemnation of them. We also get new histories of the 1950s and 1960s with the groundbreaking new research by Greg Prince, who got access to the David O. McKay papers. These informed his biography of McKay, but dialogue readers get a preview of some of the research in his 2002 article, David O. McKay and Blacks, Building the Foundation for the 1978 Revelation. There are tons of great stories behind the scenes of how McKay both blocked and facilitated change. The policy/doctrine distinction discussed earlier was a major innovation in this period. We also get access to tons of new information about the politics between church leaders in this period, including details that many church leaders wanted to change the policy as early as the 1950s, but were thwarted by those who vigorously opposed it. In the meantime, there were two major developments worth noting. One is a 2006 talk by then president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, vigorously denouncing racism. Then, in 2013, the church published the Gospel Topics essay, Race and the Priesthood, that provided a forthright look at the racism of the past and a denunciation of those teachings for the first time. The scholarship in dialogue over the past 2 decades often touches on these two themes, with further frustration with ongoing racism even after the 2013 Gospel Topics essay that disavowed early LDS teachings. It's worth pointing out that much of the scholarship produced in Dialogue's pages was by white men who were committed to racial justice, but church members of color weren't really telling their stories in our pages. I'm glad that the previous editors sought to address that in a variety of ways in recent years, and I hope that we see more of this. Race also started to take on broader issues beyond black and white in more recent analysis. In fall 2017, we see a series of articles on race and decolonization. Ignacio Garcia from BYU History and later chair of the Mormon History Association wrote Thoughts on Latino Mormons, Their Afterlife, and the Need for a New Historical Paradigm for Saints of Color. Robert Goldberg from the University of Utah wrote, Can Mormons be white in America? And Gina Colvin, There's No Such Thing as Gospel Culture. And of course, Moroni Benali's Decolonizing the Blossoming, Indigenous Peoples' Faith in a Colonizing Church. These are important new turns in the scholarship on race that deserve attention. As we approach the current trends and issues in scholarship, I want to call particular attention to the fall 2018 issue of Dialogue, published in commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the 1978 Revelation. The whole issue is full of great content, from essays to historical articles addressing racism. It includes an excellent article by Lester Bush, Looking Back, Looking Forward, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine 45 years later. He tells the story of his writing and reception of his classic 1973 article, as well as reflecting on the progress and lack thereof in the intervening period. He also gives tons of details about what Kimball was doing in the immediate years before the revelation, studying the history intensely and discussing it with church leaders and scholars. He puts forward the Brazil hypothesis, by the way, as the immediate cause. There's also a stunning article by scholar Darren T. Smith, Negotiating Black Self-Hate Within the LDS Church. Here's an excerpt. For many Black Latter-day Saints who stay and practice their faith, the emphasis of the doctrines of the Mormon gospel on family and community often trump the racist past and present. Still others have come to believe, like their white counterparts, that statements by church leaders on controversial issues are institutionally sanctioned pronouncements by God, when in fact they often reflect individual political and social bias. Thus, pointing out these inconvenient truths in the church is akin to cultural warfare. Black Latter-day Saints spend a great deal of energy reaffirming their humanity against the conservativizing forces in the church. And despite it all, these Black members remain optimistic and hopeful that the Lord will cause the scales to fall from the eyes of white folk and deliver them from the morass. To this end, Blacks in the Mormon Church exert much labor, muddling through the rigors of racial battle fatigue, straddling two distinctly different and unequal worlds. The struggle, he notes, has resulted in ongoing damage to Black members. Among the most important articles from this issue is Joanna Brooks' The Possessive Investment in Rightness, White Supremacy, and the Mormon Movement. This becomes a foundation for Brooks's 2020 book with Oxford University Press, Mormonism and White Supremacy. Her argument here is that white supremacy wasn't accidental or incidental to Mormonism, but was a key aspect of how the church survived and thrived in its 200-year history. She lays out in painful detail some episodes of white supremacy in various periods, and then links these closely together with doctrines of prophetic rightness or infallibility, making both prophets and white supremacy difficult to separate and critique. There are many more from the fall 2018 issue, but the last one that I want to highlight is a fascinating article by Matthew Harris, another major historian who has many publications on this topic. His article, Mormons and Lineage, The Complicated History of Blacks and Patriarchal Blessings, 1830 to 2018, is honestly revolutionary. He examines some understudied primary sources, namely LDS patriarchal blessings, to see how racialization doctrines developed and continue through the lineage pronouncements in these blessings. For white members, lineage from the house of Israel is frequently pronounced. Here he explains, quote, Mormon leaders created an inchoate, confusing, and unevenly applied policy. Some patriarchs pronounced the seed of Cain on Black members during their blessings, others the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while still others no lineage at all. Only in the late 20th century do we start to see some consistency. It's a remarkable paper on how local LDS patriarchs negotiated changing doctrines on racial lineage up until the present day. In 2019, Dialogue published online a collection of BYU students' experiences of racism on campus and personal accounts of how it affected them. This fall 2019 issue also has a sermon from James C. Jones titled Racism, that makes race a central moral issue, as well as a substantive sermon by Margaret Olson Hemming and Fatima Sala, Wrestling with Racism in the Book of Mormon. More than just dealing with the Bible or Pearl of Great Price, this was the first dialogue sermon to really discuss the problem of race in the Book of Mormon. The same fall 2019 issue also includes an article from BYU professor and historian Rebecca DeSchweinitz, There Is No Equality, William E. Barrett, BYU, and Healing the Wounds of Racism in the Latter-day Saint Past and Present. This article tells the story of Barrett, a religious education faculty member at BYU, hired first in 1948 and became a famous popular historian of LDS history, most famous for his best-selling book, The Restored Church. But Barrett was a segregationist in the 1950s and 1960s and frequently taught theological justifications for the church's teachings on race, tracing it back to Joseph Smith and others. He was one of the main voices in the official hierarchy perpetuating these teachings to BYU audiences and beyond. This article shows just how much racism had infused church institutions like BYU before 1978, but how Barrett continued to teach versions of these racist ideas long afterward, and how, quote, BYU religious education continues to hold some responsibility for the obstinacy of racist justifications for the temple priesthood ban. So that brings us more or less up to the present day. We have looked at how the scholarship on this issue has gone through several phases and considered some ongoing questions. The early phase discussed the injustice of the racial policies and debated the role of revelation, public and private pressure, and prejudice in shaping LDS teachings. Then the scholarship turned to more serious historical analysis of the policy, especially in the 19th century, debunking many of the popular assumptions about the origins of the policy. After 1978, historians offered further contextualization of the history of LDS racial teachings, as well as discussing the more recent historical pressures on the church in the 1950s to the 1970s. With this in mind, scholars then looked to the international context, especially in Brazil, how that might have prompted church leaders to seriously reconsider the teachings and seek new revelation. There was also a feeling of celebration as the church was marching toward equality. But more recent scholarship has moved past 1978 as a turning point and instead considered how and why racism persists among LDS members and institutions. This work, including lessons on how to confront these issues, remains central to contemporary conversations. Dialogue is proud to have broken the taboo on discussing this topic in print and being a hub for scholarship and other expressions from 1966 to the present. Thank you for taking this journey through Dialogue Journal with me, and for all your support. If you want to subscribe or donate to Dialogue, you can do so at dialoguejournal.com/subscribe. This episode was written by me, with editing and music by Daniel Foster Smith. Our content manager is Emily Jensen. The Dialogue Journal podcast is produced by the Dialogue Foundation, a registered 501c3, with support from Mary Thieves. This show was part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, a collective of independent, interesting podcasts who promote thoughtful, respectful, and engaging inquiry and discussion of all aspects of the LDS tradition, thought, and arts and culture. Like Mormon News Report, where Jenny and Brant take a deep dive into news topics pertaining to the LDS Church. Check out all the shows at dialoguejournal.com/podcast network. That's dialoguejournal.com/podcast network.